Benito Mussolini was the world's first fascist dictator. His glorification of violence inspired Hitler. Mussolini used political theater. Hitler imitated him. Mussolini dreamt of restoring the Roman Empire, Hitler of even greater world conquest. Together, these two dictators started a world war that left 55 million dead. Yet in the 1920s, world leaders were full of praise for Mussolini and fascism for standing up to the communists. The Pope said he was sent by divine providence. Winston Churchill said Mussolini was the Roman genius whose triumphant struggle against communism had rendered a service to the whole world. This is the story of Mussolini and fascism, from its violent roots to its dream of empire, from its military disasters to its humiliating end. A story told for the first time, in color. Fascism grew out of the bloody battlefields of the First World War. Italy had been fighting along with Britain, France and Russia against Germany and Austria. After 2 years of stalemate and brutal trench warfare, the Italian army cracked at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917.
Suddenly, the Austrians broke through the Italian lines, caused complete panic and havoc. A great deal of territory that was already Italy was lost, as well as the territory that Italy was fighting to gain in World War I. And it almost was a catastrophic rout that ended Italy's participation in World War I.
The Italian establishment was devastated by Caporetto, as 650,000 soldiers simply refused to fight, fleeing or surrendering instead. Among those on this desperate retreat was Ettore Ovazza, a member of a wealthy Turin banking family. Ettore had happily gone to the front with his brothers, believing, like many middle-class families, that war would build a glorious, revitalized Italy. Italy hoped to emerge from the war with an empire in Africa and a seat at the top table of European nations. But after Caporetto, Ovazza was overcome by shame.
I was riding at the head of a column of my own brigade, my head bowed, almost stupefied with anguish. I held myself in the saddle only with difficulty. My attendant came along beside me, weeping, and asked me, "Where are we going, Lieutenant, sir?" My jaw tightened, and I broke out in tears. And so we retreated.
Caporetto demonstrated Italy's military weakness to the world. It seemed that Italy was on the point of being forced out of the war completely. The nation faced ruin.
Caporetto was, of course, a military crisis, 1917, which then became a political crisis for the Italian government, the leadership as well, and for the main Italian political parties. It raised the question, first of all, whether Italy would be defeated. This would open Italy then to internal collapse and even to revolution. So Caporetto was a major crisis.
One man who rallied the public to defend Italy was Benito Mussolini, a 36-year-old journalist. At first, he'd been a fervent anti-war revolutionary socialist. Then he became passionately pro-war. He volunteered when Italy joined the war in 1915. He fought at the front, but was seriously wounded in a training exercise. Mussolini blamed his old comrades in the Socialist Party for the disaster at Caporetto. He believed their ceaseless campaign against the war had fatally undermined the army's morale.
World War I had been opposed bitterly by the working class, which didn't want to have to go fight a war it didn't understand. The Socialist Party in Italy had opposed intervention in World War I, had portrayed Italy's intervention as a capitalist war in which arms manufacturers and plutocrats were sending other people to war for their own gains.
Mussolini's former comrades became his bitterest enemies.
È in questo periodo, soprattutto con Caporetto, che egli fa un passo
It is here
ulteriore
that, especially after Caporetto, he makes another step in his political evolution towards nationalism. The only policy that Italy needed was a strong internal rule in order to fight the Austrian onslaught and, above all, to fight the internal enemies. It is here that Mussolini turns from socialist to nationalist. This was the start of Mussolini's war against the socialists.
Quella che sarà poi la guerra di Mussolini contro i socialisti.
Mussolini also hated the Vatican and the many Catholic pacifists who were opposed to the war. He felt they had betrayed Italy and stabbed the army in the back.
It was a tremendous humiliation for all patriots, tremendous, this great military collapse. And of course, they blamed, of course, socialist and also Catholic propaganda for the collapse. They said the enemies of the nation have undermined the morale of the army. They are traitors and we must have, they must really be destroyed.
In Cremona, in northern Italy, railwayman Roberto Farinacci loathed Italians who had been won over by communism, which had just won power in Russia.
Italy is in danger because of terrible subversives. Everywhere masses soaked in false theories insult Italy and sing the praises of Russia.
Before the war, Farinacci had never been an extremist, unlike Mussolini. He was a socialist reformer, but strongly pro-war. He fought briefly but bravely at the front before being called back to Cremona. As a railwayman, he was deemed an essential worker. The humiliation of Caporetto turned Farinacci into a violent nationalist. One of his first targets was Catholic lawyer Guido Miglioli, an outspoken member of parliament for Cremona who opposed the war. Farinacci wrote furiously.
That man spread his poison throughout the region, incited the women to sabotage the war, the soldiers to depose their weapons, and the people to rise as they did in Russia. He deserved more. He deserved to be swept away forever.
To rally the troops after Caporetto, the government promised land to the peasant soldiers and good jobs for the rest. This stiffened morale, and with the help of her allies, Italy was eventually victorious in 1918. But the victory celebrations did not last long. Italy did not gain its expected spoils of war. No African empire, and only limited territory on her borders. Soon the mood of the nation was one of anger and despair. And everywhere was the looming fear of communism.
There's also, of course, all of the economic and social difficulties that follow the end of a great war. Demobilization, inflation, the problems of returning to peacetime production, and, of course, the threat of Bolshevism, which hangs over Italy as it hangs over most countries in Europe at this time.
Ettore Ovazza, the wealthy Turin banker who had been in a mass retreat from Caporetto, looked out on the city he loved and was enraged by what he saw. He saw not the disciplined society he desired, but the potential horror of a communist revolution. In the city streets below, there was near insurrection, with riots and looting. The middle classes feared their property would be seized.
a sizable part of Europe was living a climate virtually of civil war after 1918. This was true throughout Central Europe, was true throughout most of Eastern Europe as well, and this kind of climate of civil war encouraged political violence.
Ettore Ovazza feared revolutionaries would also rip apart the nation he loved. He wrote in his diary,
"In the nation, political hatred spread like wildfire. From the poisoned cities, intriguers spread out to plant the seeds of class war in the countryside. The young returning home, proud of having fought with honor, many with their brave bodies wounded, were downcast and alone, shoved aside as if guilty. This cry of anguish was heard by a man who was worthy of it, by Benito Mussolini."
It was a sign of the desperation felt by solid middle-class families like the Ovazzas that they should place their faith in a man like Mussolini. He was a radical figure, still against the Catholic Church and the monarchy. From an early age, Mussolini had politics thrust on him. He was born in 1883 in Romagna, in northeast Italy, an area known for its passionate left-wing politics. His mother was a schoolteacher, his father a socialist blacksmith. They named their son after the Mexican revolutionary Benito Juarez. At school he was a violent bully. He was even expelled for stabbing a fellow pupil. He became a schoolteacher, but despite his tough reputation, he was sacked for failing to control his class. Then he discovered journalism and revolutionary socialism.
And a man who'd been hailed by Lenin in Russia as virtually the only West European socialist who was really a Bolshevik kind of revolutionary socialist. So his main set of ideas were those of revolutionary Marxism. But Mussolini was never really an orthodox Marxist, despite this salutation from Lenin. He was always a Marxist who particularly emphasized the importance of the immediate revolution and of a violent revolution that had to be carried out by violent means now.
The experience of the First World War turned Mussolini from a socialist to a nationalist, but he retained his respect for violent action. On March the 23rd, 1919, Benito Mussolini and 200 people, many disillusioned former soldiers, gathered in the Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan. Among the leaders was Roberto Farinacci. They formed a new nationalist movement, Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. Fascio, meaning bundle or bunch, indicated strength through unity, but combattimento, or fighting, showed the aggressive intent of the movement from the start. Their manifesto mixed strong nationalism with socialism, with calls for an 8-hour day, retirement at 55, a minimum wage, and more land for peasants. But Mussolini always wanted the overthrow of what he saw as decadent liberal democracy. And he was not alone. Another violent nationalist was the celebrated Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Enraged by the government's weakness, he seized the port of Fiume with his own militia of veteran soldiers. Although it had a largely Italian population, Fiume had been handed to the new state of Yugoslavia after the war, infuriating Italian nationalists. D'Annunzio spoke theatrically from balconies and dressed his militia in black, the color of death, all traits Mussolini eagerly copied.
The first people who actually wore black shirts were, funnily enough, not strictly fascists. They were involved in what I suppose you could call a rather comic opera episode, the occupation of the city of Fiume by the great Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Because it was his followers who were called the Arditi, which meant the bold ones. They were mainly composed of sort of stormtroopers, people who had been shock troops in the First World War. These were the first group who in that time wore black shirts.
The elite Arditi Special Forces had been used to launch surprise attacks on enemy trenches and were famous for their close combat fighting. Mussolini loved their directness and violence. For him, the true spirit of fascism.
You represent the admirable warlike youth of Italy. The flash of your knives and the roar of your grenades will wreak justice on all the wretches who want to hinder the advance of a greater Italy.
The Arditi wore black shirts to signify the color of death. After D'Annunzio returned to his poetry, they formed the backbone of the fascists' own violent militia, the black shirts.
The importance of the black shirts is they are essentially a combat group. The name of the fascist movement is, of course, Fasci di Combattimento, which means fighting groups. And essentially they were, and made no bones about it, these were groups for street fighting and violence.
At a veterans' meeting in Turin, Ettore Ovazza eagerly joined the black shirts.
And Ettore Ovazza enters the fascist movement as part of a movement of veterans who are getting together and asking themselves, how can we prevent these terrible things that are happening from destroying the country we've been fighting to help create. And so he was a natural recruit for the fascist movement.
It was not at all unusual for Jews like Ettore Ovazza and his family to be fascists. Although violently nationalist, the fascists, unlike the Nazis, were not anti-Semitic and did not believe in racial superiority. 1 in 3 Italian Jews later joined the fascist party, and Mussolini's mistress was Jewish. Jews were strongly nationalist because the Risorgimento, the nationalist movement which unified Italy in 1870, ended persecution of the Jews and freed them from their traditional ghettos. Jews gained full equality. This allowed Ettore's family to found Banca Ovazza and become rich and respected. Now as a black shirt, Ettore Ovazza supported the fascist attack on those who seemed to be destroying the country he loved. But after the war, the fascists were not the greatest threat to the Italian state. In the years of 1919 and 1920, a socialist revolution seemed inevitable. Strikers occupied factories, peasants seized farms. These 2 years are known as the Biennio Rosso, the Red Years. The socialist advance seemed unstoppable. In September 1920, 500,000 engineering workers occupied 300 factories in Milan. The occupation spread to other cities. The liberal government seemed paralyzed as the militancy grew. At that moment, a socialist revolution on the Russian model might have succeeded, sparking similar revolutions across Western Europe.
The problem with the Italian Socialist Party is that it had a revolutionary ideology, but it didn't have a revolutionary leadership. The orthodox Marxist in the Italian Socialist Party said, look, Italy is not a fully fledged, mature, capitalist industrial state. We have to wait. And indeed, that was their famous slogan, all we have to do is wait. You wait until the circumstances permit.
The socialists were torn between seizing power through the ballot box or the bullet.
They were winning electorally very, very successfully, particularly at a local level. They were taking over vast swathes of northern and central Italy, which to the local landed elites in itself constituted a revolution.
In the 1919 election, the socialists became the largest party in parliament. So when the owners of the occupied factories finally conceded higher wages, the socialists chose the reformist path and accepted their offer.
But the great revolutionary moment had clearly passed. I think the key importance, perhaps, of the occupation of factories is everybody sees the Socialist Party's had its chance to launch a real attempt at revolution, and it's frightened, it's drawn back.
The fascists, including Ettore e Vatsa, saw themselves as the front line against the socialist threat.
You could not really be a regular member, if you were in the right age group, without being part of this militia. Now, in Italy, the black shirts were the basic core membership of the party. So this was a kind of special party army or party militia. There really had not been, in the preceding generation in all of Europe, any kind of political movement like that.
Vatsa played his part by helping to destroy trade union offices in Turin. But although the fascists were active in the cities, fascism actually became a mass movement, much to Mussolini's astonishment, in the rural areas of central and northern Italy. Here on the flat, fertile plains, farm workers and their families tended to live in large cascine, farmsteads, where they were totally dependent on the owners. For centuries, this master-servant relationship had scarcely changed. But now this power structure was being challenged by the peasants. As the farming relied on back-breaking and labor-intensive work, the peasants knew that a strike lasting only a few days could bring ruin to the landowners. Therefore, the landowners became the natural allies of the fascists against socialists who were determined to set up workers' cooperatives to control the land. But the fascists also gained mass support from the 5 million peasants who had bought land for the first time when prices slumped after the First World War began.
So there is a mass of new landowners who are absolutely not willing to give up their land for a socialist revolution. These are the masses that gave birth to fascism. But there is also a vast mass of middle class who want to defend their property. It is they who will organize the fascist squads.
The tactics of the fascist squads were essentially tactics of violence. If they couldn't persuade or intimidate, then they simply used force to persuade people to abandon socialist trade unions, socialist peasant leagues.
Cremona in Lombardy was one of the strongholds of this uncompromising fascism. There, Roberto Farinacci was one of the most ruthless of the local leaders. Farinacci set out to break the power of the Socialist Peasant League, the Red League in the south of the province, and the radical Catholic leagues, known as the White League, in the north. The White League, headed by Farinacci's old opponent, Catholic lawyer Guido Milioli, had forced hundreds of landowners to set up small cooperatives where the peasants shared in the profits from the land. Milioli was thought by landowners to be almost as dangerous as the socialists.
He was a threat to the landowners because he'd really produced a kind of movement which set out to take away, not only to get to get higher wages or bigger share of the profits, but to actually take over in large measure the organization of farming from the landowners. I mean, one thing which these movements succeeded in doing was telling the landlords how much labor they had to use. They would say, you have to employ so many workers. So it was a threat, I think, a threat to the real rights and control of property.
In just 1 year, Milioli's White League led a series of strikes involving 6,000 farm workers in 340 cascine. When crops were left to rot and barns were burnt, Farinacci's fascists set out to destroy both the Catholic and socialist organization. The black shirt squads in northern and central Italy had one great advantage on their side: mobility.
Increasingly, they worked according to a plan. They were organized in hit groups, and they were very good at obtaining support from local authorities. They very often, for example, were carried in lorries that belonged to the army, which had been loaned to them by local garrison commanders. And they organized themselves in absolutely military fashion sometimes in order to destroy the basis of socialist activity there.
Except in Russia, political violence was not seen in Europe before World War I. The idea of systematic political violence was a product of the war, expressed primarily after the war was over. But this was a new thing. This was a new kind of political style, and this was the sort of thing that in the main part of Europe was expressed more by fascism than by any other movement, even more than by communism.
The fascist action squads glorified violence for its own sake. They thought it powerful and purifying. And before long, this violence brought murder in its wake. Milioli wrote,
The first anti-fascist martyr in the Cremonese region was Giuseppe Paoli, a very dignified peasant who was loved and respected by all for his industry and honesty.
By the end of 1920, fascism was on the march in Italy. The motto of the black shirts was "Me ne frego," I do not give a damn. They considered life cheap, just as it had been in the trenches. When the socialists defeated the fascists in the May 1921 Cremonese provincial elections, fascist attacks intensified. What the fascists could not achieve at the ballot box, they were determined to achieve by force. Once again, the Catholic leader Milioli was badly beaten. Sometimes the victims of the black shirts were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The person could be killed for wearing a carnation, the Socialist Party emblem. But often the deaths were the result of planned, systematic terror. In December 1921, Attilio Boldori, the Socialist Vice President of the Provincial Council, was kidnapped by Farinacci's fascists, taken to a cascina and beaten to death. Women and children were forced to watch, to learn the fate of those who opposed fascism. Fascist bosses in the northern provinces, like Farinacci, acted when and how they wanted.
The only thing I think one can say is that it was organised on a local level. It was organised by fascist bosses who usually were ex-officers. It wasn't, however, organised by Mussolini. There wasn't some kind of central directing plan. Very often Mussolini didn't really know what was going on, and in the summer of 1921 he actually tried to stop the spread of violence because he was afraid that there would be a backlash and that the movement would lose its credibility as a parliamentary political force if the violence in the countryside continued.
The local fascist bosses were not concerned with parliamentary procedures. They believed socialism could only be eradicated by force. Farinacci didn't beat the socialist councils in Cremona in elections. He simply stormed the town halls. Again, Milioli was targeted. His apartment was set on fire. The Liberal government protested, but was fatally weak. It refused to send an armed force to restore order and reinstate the democratically elected officials to power. Instead, a commissioner with fascist sympathies was nominated to run the province. Violence had won. Farinacci proclaimed victory from the balcony.
Fascists of Cremona, socialists have lost control of the town hall forever.
The experience of Cremona was repeated across swathes of central and northern Italy. The fascists could see victory ahead. A liberal government was officially in power, but had little control over large chunks of Italy.
In
the beginning, the state didn't understand fascist violence and saw it as a reaction to socialist violence. After fascism destroyed the socialist organizations and imposed the fascist system in the cities of northern and central Italy, the state was no longer in a condition to suppress fascist violence. But there was also some sympathy from the state, as fascism claimed it wanted to defend the state, bourgeois society, property and patriotic values, all those values that socialism deplored.
But fascism also had a very positive message.
It was very often accused of being the tool of the bosses, but the fascists were very successful at setting up their own alternative trade unions. And inasmuch as they were working alongside large landowners and, in broader terms, the middle class of the countryside and the small towns, they were in a position to offer work. In some cases even to offer small pieces of land. So they actually, yes, they had something really sort of practical to offer some of the people whom they were trying to win over.
They all built up these very powerful local machines, building a kind of totalitarian control, but only over single provinces. It was very local, but this sort of totalitarian control of single provinces. They really controlled everything.
Fascist success in rural Italy had a dramatic impact. By the end of 1921, the party had grown from 20,000 to over 200,000 members. And it tasted electoral success too. 38 fascists, including Mussolini, were elected to parliament. Fascist support was surprisingly widespread.
The hard core of the fascist movement were, in some sense or another, middle class. But there were also workers, and even some industrial workers. And one of the interesting factors, of course, is the presence of large numbers of students, out in a disproportionate way to their numbers in the population as a whole.
By the summer of 1922, the socialists had almost lost the will to fight in the face of fascist intimidation. The socialists made one final but fatal effort to stop the fascists by calling a general strike on August 1, 1922, to defend political and trade union freedoms. The strike was a failure. Strikers were replaced by fascists and the military. The fascists launched attacks on socialists and on trade union premises, often with the open support of the police and the army. The Times newspaper in London reported,
"Fascismo has proved itself virile, well-disciplined, fearless and ready for emergencies."
When the general strike was announced, Farinacci rushed to join a mass fascist attack on strikers in Parma, a socialist stronghold. The black shirt attack was led by Italo Balbo, a local fascist boss. He knew he faced a tough task.
The city has remained almost impregnable to fascism. Business activity, council and government services have all ground to a halt over the last 3 days.
The leader of the strikers, Socialist MP Guido Picelli, knew the historic importance of the struggle.
If fascism were to win, it would mean suppression of all freedoms and a return to slavery.
Yet again, the state was an impotent bystander in this clash between two armed factions. Picelli described the scenes.
At dawn, when the order was given to get the guns out and launch the insurrection, working-class people took to the streets, as bold as the waters of a river which is bursting its banks. Men, women, old people, young people from all parties and from no party at all were all there in a single iron will. Resist and fight.
fascist leader Balbo was secretly impressed.
Workers operate in shifts, military discipline. Working-class women bring anti-fascist bread, wine, fruit and potatoes from the kitchen. They must have a large quantity of ammunition, because they don't spare their bullets, shooting day and night.
The fighting raged for 6 days, forcing Balbo to concede.
For the first time, fascism found itself facing a well-organized and well-trained adversary, equipped, armed, and prepared to fight to the finish.
Finally, Mussolini ordered fascist leader Balbo to retreat. A retreat that turned into a rout. 39 fascists were killed and 150 wounded. The socialist victory showed that fascism was neither invincible nor inevitable, as Picelli clearly understood.
If we were organized and disciplined, we would be strong enough to defeat fascism 1,000 times over.
But it was a false dawn. Across Italy, the socialists were tired of fighting. The defense of Parma was the socialists' last attempt to openly defy fascism for over 20 years. Mussolini realized he had an historic opportunity to strike. The socialists were beaten, the government weak, and the army sympathetic. Even the new pope seemed to smile on fascism. Mussolini decided to organize a mass march on Rome against the liberal government. The day before the march on Rome began, local fascist bosses like Roberto Farinacci violently seized power in provinces across central and northern Italy. On October the 28th, 1922, 25,000 black shirts converged on the capital, demanding power. It was an impressive show of strength, but fascism could still have been stopped. Giovanni Battista Amendola, a cabinet minister in the liberal government, was determined to defend democracy. He drew up a decree giving the army the power to use any force necessary to stop the fascists marching into the heart of Rome. The king, Victor Emmanuel as head of state, refused to sign the decree.
The main instrument of violence in Italy was the Italian army. The leadership of the Italian army was obedient to the crown. Had the king ordered the Italian army to suppress the fascists, the army would have obeyed, and the fascists would have been suppressed.
The next day, Mussolini was invited to Rome to form a new coalition government by the king.
He had seen his major enemies in Italy being the socialists and the communists, who wanted a revolution, wanted to depose the monarchy. He had seen the moderate political parties, the regular parliamentary and more democratic parties, divided, relatively impotent, unable to cope with the situation in Italy. Therefore, what the king was doing in October 1922 was simply making the leader of the most vigorous and dynamic new political movement parliamentary prime minister of a coalition government.
The Italian government had backed down in the face of fascist violence. Though Mussolini led a constitutional government, and there were only 3 fascists in the cabinet, he ensured that he could rule by decree for the first year, and that he was in charge of all of Italy's police forces. The king had inadvertently opened the way to a full fascist state under Mussolini's leadership. Ettore Evazza was delighted by the fascist seizure of power and the new order.
From the point of view of a conservative banker, the fact that strikes had been squelched, unions had been squashed, order had been restored, were all extremely positive events. Now you had a no-nonsense government that was whipping people into shape and bringing the country into order.
The fascists moved quickly and ruthlessly against the communist foes. The British consul in Turin was astonished at the openness of the fascists.
The kidnapping and murders in what might be called the socialist quarters of the city were carried out methodically, without the slightest interference from the Royal Constabulary. Not a single arrest was made. For all practical purposes, the communists are regarded as standing outside the protection of the law, and there are still some 20 socialists and communists on the proscribed list who are being hunted down for execution.
In a Turin villa, there was a rather more joyful scene. After his second son Riccardo was born, Jewish banker Ettore Ovazza placed symbols on the cradle to represent his three passionate beliefs: the fatherland, faith, and family. All, he believed, had been saved by fascism.
On the crib where my son rests, I have planted a tricolour flag, next to the name of God, written in ancient Hebrew script on a silver pendant. This lively tricolore note, tied with a blue ribbon, seems to illuminate the room.
At that moment, Ettore heard a military band marching down the street, playing the fascist hymn.
And he's so excited, and he grabs the child and takes him to the window and says, "Look at the new Italy being born, and how fortunate you are to be born into this new world." And it gives you a very touching and very human portrait of what a sincere, if diluted, Jewish fascist would have thought and felt at that time.
Ovazza and other fascists believed that their violence was cleansing the nation. They tried to intimidate all remaining opponents of the regime. In late 1923, Giovanni Amendola, the former liberal minister who had tried to stop Mussolini, was beaten unconscious by a gang of fascist thugs. When Mussolini heard of this assault, he remarked,
"Good. Tonight I shall dine with a better appetite."
But for all the violence, the fascists remained a minority party and still did not have total power.
This left one basic fundamental question, the question of long-term political power. How really to change the situation into a Mussolini government that would be more of a fascist regime that would keep him in power, because he had no blueprint.
In Parliament, Giacomo Matteotti, a highly respected moderate socialist deputy, accused Mussolini of being ready to use force if the next elections turned against him. A triumphant cry of yes went up from the fascist deputies. Mussolini nodded his head. In the elections of 1924, amid considerable intimidation, the fascist-led coalition claimed to have won 66% of the vote. But in June 1924, Mussolini was plunged into a sensational murder scandal that threatened to destroy him forever.
This was the Matteotti affair, the murder by squadristi of the leading spokesman of the socialist opposition in Parliament, who was kidnapped and stabbed to death, and found the corpse was eventually discovered in the woods outside of Rome a couple of weeks later. So this was a major crime and atrocity that even went too far in the eyes of many fascists and created a basic political crisis.
Matteotti's murder was arranged by Mussolini's close aides. In his newspaper Il Mondo, liberal parliamentarian Amendola launched stinging attacks on fascism over the murder.
39 million Italians are kneeling along the path of Matteotti from the site of his martyrdom to his final resting place. And today they will rise to defend those ideals that factions and tyranny cannot kill, but only strengthen and glorify.
The first 6 months after Matteotti was murdered in June of 1924 were a very difficult period for Mussolini. Several fascists had deserted him. Public opinion was very volatile. The opposition parties were trying to make a great deal of capital out of the situation. There was a real fear that he would be overthrown. Indeed, he himself, I think, more or less gave up at one point and thought, well, this was it. This was the end.
But other fascists were not prepared to give up power so easily. Roberto Farinacci and 30 other fascist bosses threatened to kill Mussolini if he failed to keep fascism in control. Mussolini faced a choice between leaving power or stamping out all dissent once and for all. On January the 3rd, 1925, Mussolini strode confidently into Parliament. He did not even try to deny his role in Matteotti's death.
I declare before all Italy that I assume full responsibility for what has happened. Italy wants peace and quiet, and to get on with its work. I shall give it all these, if possible in love, but if necessary by force. In the 48 hours after my speech, the whole situation will be changed.
The January 1925 speech is the revelatory moment when fascism embarks upon the path towards dictatorship and the totalitarian state. He does it through a series of laws which eliminate the opposition deputies from parliament, which increasingly censors the press, which ultimately in 1926 leads to the dissolution of non-fascist parties and non-fascist trade unions, to the structures being put into place of a police state and a one-party state. The Vatican, like the monarchy, stayed silent.
One man did speak out, Amendola. The next day his newspaper, Il Mondo, said,
"This man Mussolini constitutes a pathological case not foreseen in the Constitution. Everything is subordinated to his mad ambition."
But in the new fascist order, no opposition was tolerated. Amendola was hunted down by the black shirts and viciously beaten. Farinacci had no doubt that this was the right course.
I believe this will serve as a lesson in order to avoid bigger trouble.
It was Amendola who coined the term totalitarismo, totalitario, saying that what Mussolini was going for, though he was proceeding only step by step, in the long run was a total, what Amendola called a totalitarian dictatorship. And he was one of the most effective spokesmen for the opposition, and someone who refused to stop and refused altogether to shut up. That was why he was dangerous.
But he was soon silenced. Amendola suffered extensive damage to his lungs from the beating. On April the 7th, 1926, he died of his injuries. He was 44. In a final insult, a group of fascists sang cheerfully as they wrecked his house after his death. Mussolini was relieved to be rid of him.
We had only one foe, an inflexible one, Giovanni Battista Amendola. He wanted to overthrow us in order to found a democracy.
But democracy was now finished in Italy. Fascism and Mussolini had complete power. The question now was, what would he do with it? The answer would shake the world. Mussolini and his fascists were violent nationalists who believed in the systematic use of violence. Fascist black shirts attacked all who opposed them, like liberals and Catholics, but their main target was socialists, who threatened a revolution like the one in Russia. In October 1922, fascists seized provinces across northern Italy, then marched on Rome in their thousands to demand power through force of arms. The king gave in and made Mussolini the world's first fascist prime minister. He became a dictator. This is the story of Mussolini in power, a story of mass adulation, a story of dreams of empire, of a disastrous alliance with Hitler, and of military failures and ignominious death, all told for the first time in color. From his earliest days in power, Mussolini's main aim was to restore the glories of the ancient Roman Empire. And his main frustration was the reality of Italy in the 1920s.
Disorganised, chaotic, unstable. That was a far cry from the Roman Empire, when Italy had been great, when it had really dominated the Mediterranean, and it had had its own massive empire. And Mussolini looked back to the past and thought, we should be there again.
Mussolini modelled his behaviour on the Roman emperors. To equal their ruthlessness, Mussolini would betray anyone, even loyal, devoted fascist families ready to die for their country. He would even betray his own family, his son-in-law and favourite daughter. Once in power, Mussolini started to build the world's first totalitarian state, bending all institutions and people to his will. To build a new type of Italian, Mussolini knew he had to start with the young.
La nostra patria.
In 1925, Mussolini decreed,
"The government demands that the school be inspired by the ideals of fascism."
Adesso bambini leggiamo una poesia di Giuseppe Zucca. Duce chiamaci.
Children were ordered to believe, obey, fight. From the age of 4, they were dragooned into fascist youth organizations, which supplied them with toy guns and black shirts.
Duce, duce chiamaci.
Duce, duce chiamaci.
La voce degli eroi.
La voce degli eroi.
School poems taught children to be ready to fight for fascism whenever the leader needed them.
La gran voce dei martiri.
La gran voce dei martiri.
In schools, they tried to inculcate patriotism, and they tried to persuade all school children that patriotism and fascism are the same thing. You couldn't be a patriot without being a fascist, and you couldn't be a fascist without loving Mussolini. Every school children would have to sort of write an essay on why I love Mussolini, or why Mussolini is the greatest man in the 20th century.
Punto. Punto.
As well as propaganda for the masses, Mussolini also created a repressive police state to enforce obedience to fascism.
They had a very powerful machine, both created by the Fascist Party and also just by the state police. Extremely far-reaching machine for surveillance, for spying. I mean, very little went on that the Fascist police, or one of the various Fascist polices, didn't know about. And there were enormous numbers of actions carried out by the police every week.
Mussolini had enormous power, but knew he still had to appease the 99% of Italians who were Catholics. And the Vatican also wanted a deal.
As a result of the Risorgimento, Italian unification in the 19th century, the Church lost its status, and it lost its property. It lost its the papal states vanished. So from 1870 until 1929, the Pope really had no country.
In 1929, Mussolini and the Vatican signed the Lateran Pacts, giving the Church virtually everything it wanted.
The Lateran Pacts of February 1929, I think, are one of the most important events in the history of 20th century Italy. First of all, they put an end to the church-state dispute. If you like, they reinserted Catholicism into Italian society. It totally changed, I think, the balance of power between the Catholic Church in Italy and the Italian state.
As with the monarchy, the Vatican much preferred the reality of fascism to the threat of communism. The Pope gained control of the Vatican City as a sovereign state and received 1.75 billion lire in compensation for historic losses, mostly in government bonds.
And the government bonds obviously meant that in some curious way, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, was underwriting the fascist state. And people at the time warned this was a very dangerous thing to be doing. The Vatican had committed itself to fascism for the foreseeable future. It had no confidence in the capacity of democracy to protect Italy against communism.
Pope Pius XI proclaimed that Mussolini was that man whom divine providence had allowed him to meet. In 1929, leading Jewish war veterans and their representatives were invited to meet the leader, seemingly gifted to Italy by divine providence. Many Jews had welcomed fascism as the rebirth of the Risorgimento, the 19th century nationalist movement that had unified Italy and set the Jews free from the ghetto. Their leader that day was Ettore Evazzo, a wealthy Turin banker. He wrote joyously about the experience in his diary.
He welcomes us with a slight smile. He is serene. Seated at his desk, he motions to us to advance. It was the first time I was to see the face of Il Duce up close.
Ettore, with his two brothers, had fought in the First World War and then joined the new fascist party. Ettore joined the Black Shirt militia and took part in their violence against socialists. To meet the Duce was the fulfillment of a dream for Ettore.
On hearing of my affirmation for the unshakable loyalty of Italian Jews to the fatherland, His Excellency Mussolini looks me straight in the eye and says with a voice that penetrates straight down to my heart, "I have never doubted it."
Ettore was overcome with a wave of emotion. Later, Mussolini would turn a blind eye when the Nazis sent thousands of Italian Jews to their death. Mussolini knew Italy had to be modernized before he could create a fascist empire to rival ancient Rome. The fascists introduced a policy of self-sufficiency for agriculture and industry. Massive public works programs to drain marshes and build roads created jobs and were hugely popular. But for Mussolini, their main aim was to prepare the Italian economy for war. The first armed conflict came with a popular rising in Libya, Italy's most important colony.
The Italians had become increasingly ruthless. They'd use mass rapes, desecration of mosques, rounding up civilians into concentration camps, mass starvation, the use of chemical weapons against civilians and guerrilla combatants.
100,000 civilians were probably killed between 1929 and 1932 in the pacification of Libya, as it was called. So it's really outside of Italy, in the foreign wars, in the colonial campaigns, that fascism showed its particularly violent and brutal side.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Mussolini regarded Hitler as a junior partner who had copied him in his rise to power, but he was jealous of Germany's military power.
He realized that Hitler's rise to power was going to destabilize the situation in Europe, and this destabilization would begin to open a window of opportunity for Italy's action.
Ettore Ovazza, the Jewish banker, worried that this was potentially a tragic turning point for Italian Jews. But to his relief, Mussolini ridiculed Hitler's racial theories.
Nothing will make me believe that biologically pure races can be shown to exist today.
But in 1934, when 2 Turin Jews were caught smuggling anti-fascist literature into Italy, some newspapers called it a Jewish anti-fascist plot. Ettore panicked, fearing the return of Jewish persecution. He started his own newspaper to publicly demonstrate that Jews were patriotic and pro-fascist.
We are soldiers. We are fascists. We want to kiss the tricolour flag, for which we are always ready to fight and die.
There was no automatic reason Mussolini and Hitler would be allies, despite their shared views. They first clashed over Austria. Italy wanted it to be independent, rather than part of Germany. Hitler, however, had other ideas.
If one reads the very first page of Mein Kampf, Hitler's infamous book, the first thing he says is Austria must yet again return to the German mother country. And it wasn't just rhetoric, he meant it.
In 1934, Mussolini had made Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law, head of his press office. Just 4 years earlier, Ciano seemed to have made the best career move ever. Aged 27, he married Benito Mussolini's adored daughter, Edda. This relationship would end in a family tragedy of Shakespearean intensity. But in 1934, Ciano hero-worshipped Mussolini, imitating his gestures, his uniforms, and his speech. Ciano's first job was to ridicule the Führer. After Mussolini and Hitler clashed over Austria, Ciano briefed journalists that Hitler was a madman, hell-bent on world war. But the Duce's dreams of empire would draw him inexorably into an embrace with the Nazi leader. In 1935, fascist forces invaded Ethiopia, Africa's last independent nation. Ciano was among the 600,000-strong Italian invasion force. He took part in bombing raids on civilians and proudly boasted,
"We have carried out a slaughter."
The way that Mussolini dealt with the Ethiopian question, I think, shows just how calculated and ruthless the man really was.
The Ethiopians fought back desperately.
So then the order was issued by Mussolini in December 1935 to make widespread use of chemical weapons, mustard gas and phosgene, and to use terror tactics en masse.
The Italians even deliberately bombed 19 Red Cross hospitals. Over 250,000 Ethiopians were killed in the fighting.
For a long time, people have tried to conceal that the Ethiopian War and other forms of fascist colonial repression used such ruthless methods. Today, we know this for certain. And I think this has given us more evidence to disprove those who now present fascism as a benevolent, patriotic dictatorship that was polluted and led astray only by the alliance with Germany.
Ethiopia wasn't just about the Italians conquering Ethiopia, it was about them taking on the international order. It was about challenging the predominant Mediterranean powers, the British and the French, for eventual control. That battle, that route to global war, started really in Europe with the Ethiopian crisis of 1935.
Mussolini's aggressive foreign policy was hugely popular at home, but poisoned relations with Britain and France. Mussolini knew that in contrast to Britain and France, he had Hitler's backing in Ethiopia. And then both dictators backed General Franco when he rose against a left-wing government in Spain. Mussolini sent 80,000 Italian troops to fight for Franco in the ensuing Spanish Civil War. As the European crisis mounted, Mussolini promoted his 33-year-old son-in-law Ciano to the key post of Foreign Secretary. But the more time Ciano spent with the Nazis, the more he feared for Italy's future. Ciano started to keep a secret diary, which survives as one of the most remarkable insider accounts in 20th century history. One of the first entries describes Mussolini's visit to Hitler in Berlin in 1937.
Mussolini captured crowds with his magnetism, his voice, and his impetuous youthfulness. Will the solidarity of the regimes be sufficient to keep two nations whose race, culture, religion and tastes are exact opposites really together?
But Ciano knew that there was no alternative to the Nazis if Italy wanted to challenge the power of Britain and France.
Today, the Rome-Berlin axis is something very real and extremely useful.
The fascists and Nazis provided impressive military support to Franco, practicing techniques they would perfect in the Second World War. One was the bombing of civilians to create mass terror. Ciano gloated over its effect in Barcelona.
The entire raid lasted only 1.5 minutes. Buildings pulverized, traffic interrupted, panic that became insanity. 500 dead, 1,500 wounded.
In February 1938, Mussolini decided to partially imitate Hitler and impose harsh anti-Semitic laws.
The Germans never asked the Italians to introduce racial anti-Semitism. There is no evidence to suggest that Mussolini came under pressure from Hitler.
Mussolini believed Hitler's ruthless policies had created a military juggernaut that would roll across Europe.
Since he was a Machiavellian and a pragmatist and wanted Italy to assume its place among the great nations, he had a whole ideology that if you were really a serious person, you brushed aside any kind of humanitarian concerns about who you might be stepping on in order to further the cause of national greatness. Crushing the rights of a few thousand Jews in Italy was a small price to pay for national greatness.
Ovazza and the 47,000 Italian Jews were unaware of the fate that would befall them. On the 11th of March 1938, Ciano wrote a bare phrase.
6 p.m. Austria is no longer independent.
Without a murmur, Mussolini had allowed Hitler to annex Austria to the Third Reich. Overnight, Italy lost her buffer state. Many more disasters would follow. Mussolini wanted to be seen to be ruthless, just like Hitler. Ciano revealed.
The truth about the bombing of Barcelona is that Mussolini gave the orders. Franco knew nothing, and yesterday asked us to suspend them for fear of foreign complications.
Ciano noted.
Mussolini claimed to be pleased by the fact that Italians managed to horrify by their aggression instead of giving pleasure as mandolin players. This, in his opinion, makes us rise in the consideration of the Germans, who love total and ruthless war.
Mussolini also told Ciano,
Italians must learn to be less sympathetic, to become hard, implacable, hateful, masters.
Mussolini tried to impress Hitler by declaring that Italians were Aryans like the Germans. The Jews were an inferior race.
Formal laws are then passed, effectively disenfranchising the Jewish community in its entirety, kicking them out of public office, kicking Jewish school children out of school, preventing them from attending university, participating in public office.
Ettore Ovazza, the proud patriotic war veteran and devoted fascist, wrote a personal appeal to the Duce.
I write poorly because my hand is trembling. It is the end of a reality, that of our feeling one with the Italian people. How many, starting in 1919 and up until today, have followed you with love through so many battles, wars, living your life? Is all this over? Was it all a dream we nurtured?
Mussolini's first edicts divided the Jews. Long-standing fascists like Ovazza and decorated Jewish veterans were allowed to keep their jobs and businesses, and even to remain fascist party members. Meanwhile, Hitler continued on the road to war. Now he gave Czechoslovakia an ultimatum: give up the German-speaking provinces of Sudetenland or face invasion. Ciano lamented.
Naturally, the objective will be to destroy Czechoslovakia completely. It is war. God protect Italy and the Duce.
Europe held its breath. But at the last moment, Britain begged Mussolini to try to delay the German ultimatum by 24 hours. That evening, Mussolini and Ciano departed for Munich. Hitler told Mussolini he wanted all of the Sudetenland, which had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire but had been ceded to the new state of Czechoslovakia after the First World War. At the Munich conference, Mussolini presented Hitler's plan as his own. All the leaders signed the Munich Agreement that gave Germany the Sudetenland. In return, Hitler promised this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Czechoslovakia was left defenseless, having lost nearly all her mountain fortifications. But appeasement had averted the war. Ciano witnessed the resulting adulation.
In Italy, from the Brenner Pass to Rome, from the king to the peasants, the Duce receives welcomes as I have never seen.
Mussolini won great respect abroad and great popularity at home because he appeared as the peacemaker. But there's a very funny thing about this, that Mussolini himself wasn't at all pleased. He went home muttering, all the crowds are cheering me as the man of peace. But I don't want to be the man of peace. I want to be the man of war.
A few days after this crisis, Mussolini introduced even tougher anti-Semitic laws. These laws ended equality for all Jews, even dedicated fascists. Ettore Ovazza had to sell the family bank and resign from the fascist party. In March 1939, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement. German troops marched into the rump of Czechoslovakia, the first time they had occupied non-German speaking territory. Hitler did not even warn Mussolini. Only afterwards, the German ambassador Hess told Mussolini,
"The Führer thanks Italy for unshakable Italian support."
Mussolini was in despair.
Every time Hitler grabs a country, he sends me a message.
The march of fascism seemed unstoppable when Franco finally triumphed in the Spanish Civil War. To keep up with Hitler, Mussolini seized Albania in April 1939. Later that year, Ciano wrote,
First report of imminent action against Poland. War.
Ciano knew Italy was not ready for war.
The ammunition depots are lacking in ammunition. Artillery is outmoded. Our anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons are altogether non-existent. Our gold reserves are reduced to almost nothing. We must avoid war.
Despite this, Mussolini ordered his foreign minister, Ciano, to go to Berlin to sign one of the most disastrous military agreements in history, the Pact of Steel. This required Italy to go to war whenever Germany did. In this agreement, both Germany and Italy promised not to provoke a major European conflict for at least 3 years. But just 3 months later, in Salzburg, Ciano learned directly from Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, of Hitler's real plans.
He said, gazing at me with his cold metallic eyes,
"We want war. Poland must be invaded, defeated, annihilated, and annexed to the Third Reich in the same fashion as Austria and Czechoslovakia."
Hitler basically followed his own designs. He marched to his own drummer. He implemented his own foreign policy. He didn't even take Italy into consideration in terms of discussion before considering his major changes in foreign policy.
After meeting Hitler, Ciano knew Europe would be engulfed in war.
He has decided to strike, and strike he will. The fate that might befall us does not interest them in the least.
Ciano felt desperate and powerless.
I returned to Rome completely disgusted with Germany and its leaders. They have betrayed us and lied to us.
But even Ciano could not have guessed what was coming next. Hitler stunned Italy with a political masterstroke. He signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, which secretly carved up Poland.
5:25 a.m. Germany attacks Poland. 11 a.m. Britain declares war on Germany.
Ciano struggled hard to keep Mussolini out of the war.
The idea of joining the Germans attracts him, but I must fight to the end. Otherwise, it will mean the ruin of the country, the ruin of fascism, and the ruin of the Duce himself.
Mussolini told Ciano,
"The Italians, after having heard my warlike propaganda for 18 years, cannot understand how I can become the herald of peace, now Europe is in flames."
Mussolini, I think, always saw Italy's inability to enter the war in September 1939 as a failure, something which he was embarrassed about, rather ashamed of. He is still, in international terms, a revolutionary, that he is a man with a mission. He has to leave his mark on history by making Italy great or greater. He can't do this without war.
As the Germans swept across democratic Europe in 1940, Mussolini could restrain himself no longer. He declared war on France and Britain. Ciano wrote,
"The adventure begins. May God help Italy."
The most awful, I think the most contemptible reason Mussolini gave for going to war was he said, "We need a few thousand dead in order to be able to sit at the conference table." And he thinks that's going to be it.
In the first month, the Italian army made little progress in its invasion of France. Mussolini blamed his soldiers rather than himself.
It is the material that I lack. Even Michelangelo needed marble to make statues. If he had only clay, he would have been nothing more than a potter.
Mussolini planned to run a parallel war with Germany. While Hitler grabbed territories north of the Alps, he would grab countries around the Mediterranean. Mussolini launched an attack on the British in Egypt, hoping to seize the Suez Canal. The British withdrew. Ciano noted,
Mussolini is radiant with joy.
At Ciano's urging, and as a way of showing his independence, Mussolini decided to seize Greece without informing Hitler.
It was felt that Greece would be a sort of nice, easy target. It was felt the Greek military weren't up to a fight. The Italians were already in Albania, of course. It was simply a job of stepping over the border and Greece would collapse.
Mussolini had managed to bribe a number of top Greek generals. He assumed because he had various Greek generals on the Italian payroll, they were going to sell out their own army. This wasn't the case.
What actually transpired was the Italians began the offensive with very little planning. It's a very highly improvised operation. The weather was appalling.
This was the autumn, during the time of the autumn rains, very bad weather, to move across Balkan mountains into Greece. The result was that the invasion was a complete failure.
The Greek army dug its heels in and fought back and pushed the Italians back into Albania. So it was disastrously ill-conceived and disastrously carried out operation.
Mussolini had ignored military advice in ordering the invasion. Yet again, he was furious with his soldiers.
The human material I have to work with is useless, worthless.
Hitler now had to rush troops to invade the Balkans and Greece. Mussolini was humiliated.
The last thing Mussolini wanted was the Germans anywhere in his sphere of operations whatsoever. So to have to admit defeat and then see his principal ally having to occupy not only Greece but also Yugoslavia, which is of course a border state with Italy, was a pretty serious humiliation. And I think marks really the first point when you could say the man or Mussolini's authorities are beginning to erode.
The Italians faced another shattering blow in Libya.
British and Commonwealth armoured spearheads simply went straight through the Italian lines like a knife through butter, something like 400,000, 500,000 prisoners taken in a very short time by the British as a result. And again, shows the Italians simply are not capable of running, of running a modern war.
And now he has to play second fiddle to his ally in Nazi Germany. And this gets worse and worse as time goes on. Every place Italy fought virtually was a defeat for Italy.
From now on, Mussolini was completely in Hitler's hands. At 3 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, Mussolini was woken to be told of the German attack on the Soviet Union. There had been no consultation, no forewarning. Mussolini was angry and humiliated.
Even I don't dare disturb my servants at night, but the Germans make me jump out of bed at any hour without the slightest consideration.
Germany was now the absolutely dominant partner in the Axis. Italians felt powerless. The great question in Italy was, who is really the enemy? The popular saying on the streets was, if England wins, we lose, but if Germany wins, we are lost. Mussolini shared the very same suspicion. He told Ciano bitterly,
I now seriously ask whether an English victory would not be more desirable for our future than a German victory.
There were massive food shortages across Italy. But Mussolini had no sympathy with his people in their hunger.
I tell you that around springtime, the rations will be even less. And this delights me, because we will finally see signs of suffering on the faces of Italian people, which will be valuable to us around the peace table.
To curry favor with Hitler, Mussolini sent 230,000 ill-equipped troops to join the German invasion of Russia. The secret police reported growing anger over the military disasters.
Certainly the experience of fascist Italy on the battlefields, starting with the defeat in Greece in October 1940 and the loss of the East African colonies in 1941, and then the loss of Libya in 1942, means basically the collapse of a big delusion that Italy would become a big power through fascism.
In December 1942, Soviet forces defeated Italian troops on the River Don.
The Italian defeat in Russia, with over 85,000 killed, is in fact a sort of tombstone for the ambitions of Mussolini and fascist Italy.
1943 began disastrously for the Rome-Berlin axis, the catastrophe of Stalingrad, and a retreat everywhere along the North African front, the fall of Tripoli. Ciano still admired Mussolini, but knew he had to go.
I think that before long it will be necessary to place all powers in the hands of the military.
But Mussolini sacked Ciano for opposing the alliance with Germany.
Our leaving was cordial, for which I am very glad, because I like Mussolini, like him very much, and what I shall miss most will be my contact with him.
Italian defeats escalated through 1943 with mass surrenders to the Allies in North Africa. When Allied forces landed in Sicily, 12,000 more surrendered without firing a shot. 3 years of military disasters had destroyed the foundations of Italian fascism. Finally, on July the 25th, 1943, Mussolini was toppled by a group of leading fascists, who then meekly handed constitutional power back to the king. The Duce, the Iron Dictator, was a broken man.
You could almost say that he was depressed. I mean, it's perhaps not clinically so, but I think that there's something almost apathetic about Mussolini's conduct. I think that he really almost at that point felt that he had lost the game and that there was something sort of almost inevitable about his fall from power.
To Mussolini's horror, one of the leaders of the rebellion was Ciano, his own son-in-law, who had been at his side as foreign minister during 6 tumultuous years. This set in train a terrible family tragedy, an echo of the national tragedy about to befall Italy. At first, there was euphoria. 20 years of fascism seemed to have melted away like snow. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio, former head of the armed services, as the new prime minister. Badoglio imprisoned Mussolini and also arrested Ciano, who was accused of massive corruption. But the chance to shorten the war and bring peace to Italy was botched.
It turned out to be a fiasco. The Allies and Badoglio could not coordinate what was going to happen. Badoglio and the king pulled up and left Rome in a disaster, a disgrace, in flight to go head south.
Before fleeing into the welcoming arms of the Allies, the king announced Italy had changed sides.
And the Italian army and the Italian nation just unraveled overnight, the night of September 8th, which is known also in Italian history as the catastrophe.
Italy was traumatized. The Germans moved quickly to take control of the country. Some Italians, outraged by the king's surrender, fought on with the Germans. Others were delighted to join the Allies. Many simply laid down their arms. Italy now faced the horror of civil war. But Hitler still admired Mussolini and personally ordered a daring airborne raid which successfully rescued him from his mountain prison. Hitler installed Mussolini as head of a new fascist government, the Italian Social Republic, or Salo Republic, in German-occupied northern Italy.
It was a mere puppet government. It was a shadow government that Mussolini technically ran the country, but he was at under orders of the Germans.
As Italy crumbled into chaos and civil war, the Ovazza family fled Turin and headed for a hotel close to the Swiss border. With Ettore were his wife, Nella, son Riccardo, and daughter, Ellen.
It must have been a tremendously complicated and tragic time for him. Fascism had failed visibly. It had collapsed. Mussolini had been deposed. The dreams of greatness had not measured up to reality. And he personally had sacrificed everything for this cause which had now failed.
They had taken with them gold, jewels, and foreign currency. Unknowingly, Ettore was taking them into a very dangerous world.
At the time, there were all kinds of unscrupulous characters and profiteers who are making money off of the desperation of many people who are trying to sneak over into the border into Switzerland.
Riccardo was of military age, and Ettore feared he might be seized. So he found a mountain guide to take Riccardo to Switzerland. Ettore gave his son 50,000 Swiss francs. A few days later, the Ovazzas were enjoying a meal together, until Gestapo officers sat down close to them. Tension filled the room. The Gestapo men told Ettore his son had been arrested for smuggling foreign currency across the border. Ettore was made to pay their bill. The three were taken to a school commandeered by the German SS. Then Ettore Ovazza, the loyal fascist Jew, was led forcibly to the school's basement. Mother and daughter followed, now relaxed, even smiling, as if assured no harm would come to their family. But once inside, all three were brutally executed.
Incredibly, their bodies are then chopped up into pieces. A fire is lit, and they begin to burn these bodies right there in the schoolhouse. It's one of the strange and extraordinary ironies that among the first victims of the German occupation of Italy should be one of the most loyal adherents to fascism.
Ettore was one of the first, but there would be many others. The Germans occupied Rome. They immediately sent 5,700 Jews to extermination camps. Another 615,000 Italians were sent into forced labor in Germany. Mussolini, who the Nazis had installed as the head of the Salo Republic puppet government in northern Italy, said nothing. This new fascism was more brutal than ever.
It is an enraged fascist party, enraged by the coup against Mussolini on July the 25th, enraged by the surrender of September the 8th, enraged that the regime has been too tolerant with half-hearted fascists or with non-fascist Italians, and therefore it demands more strictness and more violence.
One of the first to feel its wrath was Ciano. In prison, he awaited the revenge of the father-in-law he had helped to depose. He wrote the last entry in his secret diary. The rest had already been smuggled to Switzerland by his wife.
The policy of Berlin towards Italy was nothing but a web of lies, intrigue and deceit. We were never treated like partners, but always as slaves. Only Mussolini, in his supreme cowardice, could, without reaction, tolerate this and pretend not to see it.
Mussolini then proved Channel right. He could have saved his son-in-law, as his daughter begged him to, but that would have betrayed weakness in front of his German masters. This remarkable film of Ciano's execution was made to prove Mussolini's iron resolve and his dedication to Hitler's service. By 1944, it was clear the Axis had lost the war. Yet an astonishing 250,000 Italians still joined Mussolini's new Republican Fascist Party, proving fascism's enduring appeal. 40,000 even joined a new armed force called the Black Brigades to fight anti-fascist partisans during 1944 and 45.
So that there then ensued a kind of Italian civil war between fascists and anti-fascists during that last 18 months of World War II.
The partisans, often led by communists, destroyed communications and attacked German troops. In reprisal, the German SS, supported by the Black Brigades, carried out a brutal campaign of suppression which led to the indiscriminate slaughter of thousands of civilians, often women and children.
This was the nastiest part of the entire regime, particularly inside Italy, because there were a lot of political executions, the liquidations of lots of hostages, mass killings, tens of thousands of people died. This was by far the worst aspect of the regime inside Italy during the entire fascist period. But it was above all a fight for Italy's future.
Of course, partisans saw themselves primarily as seeking to liberate Italy from German occupation, German control. But they also saw it as a war against restored fascism. There was a very real element of using the armed resistance to prepare a post-fascist, a post-war future that perhaps would be communist and revolutionary.
On April the 27th, 1945, Benito Mussolini, his mistress Clara Petacci, and several fascist leaders were seized by partisans. Ironically, the man who had come to power as the man to stop communism was gunned down by a communist.
He was just cut down by a burst of submachine gun fire from this communist partisan leader. Very dramatic, very, very brutal, if you like. And then, of course, his corpse and that of Clara Petacci were hung up feet first in the piazzale in one of the piazzas of Milan. That may appear very horrible and unjustified, but it has to be said that it was also a sort of symbolic reprisal, because the fascists had previously hung a lot of partisans in that same square.
For a lot of people, they said, well, that sounds like the end of fascism to me. Was it? Well, probably not. I mean, there was fascism went deeper than just Mussolini and his girlfriend and a few others hanging at the gas station.
Once the Allies held Italy, the West once again saw communism as a far greater threat than Italian fascism. Senior judges, civil servants, military leaders and even police chiefs who had served under fascism were allowed to slip quietly back into office. And fascism as a political force did not die with Mussolini.
There is still, right across Italy, a widespread sense of sympathy for this man. An unwillingness to accept that maybe there's a bit more to him than just public works programs, road building and draining marshes. There was a bit more to it than that. The war on violence, the revolutionary ideology, this attempt to revolutionize Italy and make it a more martial, more aggressive society, and caused, let's not forget, the death of 55 million people. Let's never forget Mussolini's responsibility in the Second World War.